Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Inside City Hall, where we bring you the people, policies, investments, and other issues that are shaping the future of our city. And today we're really fortunate to be joined by the Senior Director of Development at Google, Alexa Arena, who's going to talk to us a bit about the new Google Downtown West project in San Jose, which is one of the most significant investments in the history of our city, and it's going to have a big impact for many years to come. So Alexa, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You bet. So I think you wanted to maybe kick off with a little bit of an overview of the project. And there's a lot of interest. I get a lot of questions from residents who are excited that Google's making an investment in the city and bringing jobs and housing. But I think still a lot of questions about what exactly is this campus going to look like, and what's the timeline, and that sort of stuff. So do you want to start with your overview?
Yeah, and the overview is really just designed to baseline people on kind of what the project is so that we're all starting from a similar place. But yes, I'll try to keep it 5 minutes, especially since I'm excited to get into a nice Q&A from some good questions that have come from your constituents. So with that, I'll sort of jump right into the overview. For those who don't know, Downtown West is a significant land area within the downtown station area plan, the Dearborn Station area plan, which is of course a much larger planning effort that's underway with the city around how to make the area adjacent to Dearborn Station that is so incredibly transit rich, a thriving mixed use environment. And so when we first looked at the opportunity for the 80 acres approximately that constitutes Downtown West, it was largely zoned for office, and it hadn't yet had the height adjustment from the OEI heights, which are sort of the heights are set by the airport and the flight paths. And so there was extra capacity. And when we got out there and started talking to people about what we could do with that extra capacity, by and large, the excitement was around this idea of really creating a mixed use environment, a central social district where San Jose and all that is so vibrant in it can come together. We see that today so strongly in the moments of celebration, events, and festivals that come about and are so frequent in San Jose, which makes it such a phenomenal city. And I think the vision was like, is there a center point where we have consistency around that gathering? And so what are the right types of land uses that help support that? In addition to, though San Jose needs a lot of office growth, making sure that residential is coming online with that, and particularly affordable housing. So the ultimate program is roughly the same amount of office that was originally allowed for through the zoning, but an additional 4,000 housing units and about 500,000 square feet of what we're calling active uses. And why we call those active uses, it's not always retail. Sometimes it's also cultural, arts, education uses, those uses that bring us together, and about 15 acres of parks, plazas, and green space. And so that really creates what is, much more the basis for that central social district. It's about 25% affordable housing, it is in the DSAP as a commitment, and that allows us to also have a more inclusive environment. We leaned in heavily as well to things like restoring and expanding the riparian habitat. As we're all seeing, it's really important to have immersive nature in our cities, and it's important to give back to nature and also to nod towards the fact that we've got a lot of climate change goals that we have to lean into in order to make sure our climate is healthy going forward and more resilient as a city. So there are zero net new CO2 emissions that will come from the project. That's happening through things like having a microgrid in a district system, which are just much more resilient and sustainable ways to grow on the energy grid and on things like water use and so forth. As I said, really over and over again, when we heard from the great amount of engagement we had, is that this needs to be a place to gather. It shouldn't feel like a corporate campus. It should feel like a part of the city that represents all of who San Jose is. And we had so much, we are so thankful for the amount of participation an engagement we had with people. People spent so much time speaking with us in various forums. Oftentimes we were going out to where people were. So whether that was joining Viva Calle and making sure we had a booth that was engaging and where we could get some really good feedback, or also bringing people to the site, having tours, having conversations, and the like. So we had lots of different varying ways to engage, not the least of which was what the city had instituted, which was called SAG, which was the Station Area Advisory Group. That was a great composition of neighborhood leaders who represented a diverse group of thinking, and we could check in with and go deep with. So we were very fortunate to have that. We were able to continue that post-COVID, and we did that through videos, sort of like what we're doing here, and subsequent activities, whether that was surveys, whether that was conversations and Zoom meetings, et cetera, to help us really make sure that we were still getting the exchange out there so that we could really move a process of planning, which we think is really San Jose's does such a progressive job through this plan and doing, from going through just listening of those very static meetings to really thinking about co-creating, rolling up our sleeves with people and figuring out how we can be really user-led and how this place can become a platform for all that is great to continue to flourish within San Jose. So there's just a couple of different examples of how we do that. And I will say COVID gave us, almost a finer point to the importance of rethinking how to build and grow cities better. That was a big challenge from people coming before COVID, and it even exacerbated after COVID. And that was really an inspiration of how do we have cities that are really representative of the local place, that are authentically about the values and the creativity that is San Jose. So you come to downtown West and you feel like there's no other city but San Jose that this could be. We also knew that we had to lean in, as we talked about, to ecology and how we use the fact that we're along the creek, which today is not a very user-friendly environment, but in the future creates the potential to have incredible immersive nature at the doorstep of major transit. And that's a very unique opportunity. So 20% of the project area is green open space. And what we know from statistics is that reduces when you transition from parking lots to that, it can reduce depression rates by up to 50%. So it has big public health outcomes as well. We know we need a smarter, greener way forward with mobility infrastructure and net zero to get people out of their cars and into connecting. And we know we needed to map, not just for the site, but how the site's connected to this part of the city. So we used the 15-minute urban neighborhood of how do we build this part of the city to first connect with what is there and strengthen with what is there and add to that to create complete neighborhoods. We also work deeply with the equity community, and we're so impressed by that exchange and how much we learned a tremendous amount of how do we have a more inclusive way to grow within San Jose. And what launched out of that was a really unique governance structure for a $150 million fund that over time invests in housing stability, education, and job access. And so it gives us the flexibility to have a heavily weighted community run, impact run. So for those who have historically been marginalized, they're the strongest voice in this community fund in terms of how it's implemented. But Google always has a collaborative seat on there. It's not a voting seat, but it's an opportunity for us to continue to collaborate with the community to get to these goals together over time. So all in all, this was really about not just figuring out the physical modality of how we get more office space. This is really thinking about how can we create together with San Jose a strengthening and a densification within the city around all the great things that San Jose is, within a very intentional project that leans into big challenges of our times like climate change and social equity. So we're very proud of that and proud of the work that we've done with the community to get here, but we know it's just a start. And so I'm sure people's first questions are, okay, when's the next step coming? And we know that's when the rubber meets the road. So certainly we're at the beginning versus the end of the journey, and we really look forward to progressing it. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thanks, Alexa. That was a fantastic overview, and I think it's a really exciting vision. And I'm just, I'm struck by how holistic the approach is, how you're integrating so many different components of what it is to have a high quality of life and to live in a vibrant, diverse city that creates opportunity for everyone. So I want to talk a lot more about a number of the things you touched on. Just for our audience, and thank you again for those of you who are joining us live. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat and we'll try to get them answered toward the end. Alexa and I are gonna have a little bit of a fireside chat here, if you will, where we'll take the next maybe 20 minutes to just go a little deeper on some of these topics, and then we'll wrap up with a few audience questions. So Alexa, thanks again for that overview. I guess just on that point about how uniquely comprehensive and holistic the approach is, I mean, when I think about large employers making an investment, typically you think about commercial office buildings and jobs, but this is so much more than that. Are you developing this way in other places? And this just is, how cutting edge is this approach? And what can you tell us about how the way that even Google is a real leader in this space, but just how your own thoughts on how you build campuses have changed over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that inspired me personally to join the Google team is the person who's running our development team comes from a background of what I would call very progressive or very integrated and thoughtful development. And he, has really brought what I would say is triple bottom line thinking to how do we think about our places in our cities. He was one of the first person, his name's Joe Van Bellingham, but to do an environmental, like kind of reach a higher level of sustainability. He did the project 20 years ago, but within globally, worldwide. So and then he was part of the foundational aspect of like LEED and the LEED system and so forth. So and then US GBC. So he's been a leader for some time within that. And what he was really interested in is how do we think holistically? This isn't a zero, none of these things are a zero-sum game. So you don't have to trade off business needs for environmental needs for equity needs. There's ways to have win-wins, but they are more complicated. They are about leaning into interdisciplinary or dependencies that sometimes we can all just get extremely overwhelmed with, especially in cities that are very complex. But, it's about finding those win-wins and those opportunities where we can, as a business, say, let's invest in microgrids because microgrids help us be resilient as a business, in addition to contributing greatly to our climate change goals. And so those are the things that allow us to really achieve the comprehensiveness of this project.
Yeah, let me just follow up on that, and then maybe we can talk about microgrids, and we'll just kind of jump around a few different topics here. But it seems to me that in order to take that progressive approach, as you put it, you probably need to think on a longer timeline, because a lot of these decisions, I imagine, don't actually make sense in terms of a traditional shareholder value theory for your next quarterly earnings report, I would assume. So tell me, how do you, I'm just curious, inside of Google, how do you think about ROI and your responsibility to your shareholders and these other considerations?
Yeah, we really compare it to, when you go out and lease a building, you're sort of implicitly paying to a developer the cost for that building and the return they need to make on the building. Yep. And what we're really able to do at Google is think long term and say we can't for our shareholders have a cost equivalent that's much higher than leasing. But we can really reinvest some of what would have been a developer profit or developer return into some of those important fundamentals that help us on long-term strategic goals. And then also just help to build more resilient cities. And so I do think you're absolutely right. This is harder to do for a typical developer who is profit oriented, and they have to be because that's where their capital comes from and they have certain requirements. Otherwise, they can't move forward with a project. we also have to be, you know, reliant on, I can't go to our board and say, I'm going to do something that's going to cost you so much more than leasing. But because we don't have to make that profit, we're able to think of it differently and invest for the long term of, we really want to become a part of San Jose. We don't want San Jose to become a different place than what it is today, because from our perspective, that's what we love about San Jose. It's diversity, it's you know, a sense of cultural inclusion, its history. All of these things are what we want to see, you know, increase and proliferate versus decrease. And so we're just sort of more naturally aligned to create
Yep.
this type of outcome.
That makes sense. And I love your point about finding those win-wins. And over a longer time frame, it's probably easier to find
Much
those
easier.
win-wins. I know one that I'm personally passionate about as a former public school teacher in San Jose is ensuring that our young people across the city have, are given the kinds of educational opportunities to eventually get jobs at places like Google. But just to go back to, you mentioned the microgrid, and this was a component of the vision for the project that I found really fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more about what exactly Google's envisioning for this microgrid?
Yeah, and a lot of times people hear the word microgrid, and you know, I've learned a lot about this space. You know, so I'll say even for myself, I thought it was an assumption of like, so you're creating the electricity all on your own, and that's not what it is. That's sort of an island effect where you're just functioning on your own. What it really does is it still connects into the PG&E grid, but then it distributes within the buildings. It creates its own system in order to balance out loads, to utilize solar and a variety of other um, renewable energy sources that we have on site, and to also invest in clean energy coming to the site from elsewhere in order to substantially improve the efficiency of electricity, and then also to invest in battery storage eventually and smooth out the loads so that you don't have the peaks and valleys, and you're able to then subsequently have an energy system that's more resilient, that doesn't take as much from the base infrastructure. So it's not taking as much load from PG&E system, which helps. We know in California, we need more efficient ways to grow that infrastructure as it's struggling for us, and has the capacity that when the system does go down, it is still able to function for a period of time, because it is partly performing on its own through those renewables and through the battery storage. And so it likewise, lastly, I would say helps also with costs. So over time, whereas, you know, with PG&E, we could see some spikes in pricing, it is able to smooth those out. And so that really helps with residential, the affordable housing components that are connected to the grid. So it's helping in all sorts of ways. And I think it's representative of sort of climate change, which is also an equity issue as much as it is an environmental issue of like, how do we find ways to create energy and create resources in a more resilient way, and in a more consistent way, which then allows for the stability of things like everything from prices to, just being more resilient in times of great impact.
Right. And you're not just doing this with the power grid component, you're also making real investments around recycled water and some other
Exactly.
kind of, yeah. So do you want to just describe quickly what else you're
Yeah,
doing on
we
that
are
front?
actually already underway on a lot of that recycled water work in Sunnyvale, actually. And so some of this part of the industry is more mature than the microgrid. And so we have plans for things like black water and gray water recycling plants, which allow for obviously just the way more uh, resilient use of water. And so you're not always pulling in new water, but you're able to, at the source, which allows it to happen in a much cleaner and more effective way, treat the water and bring it back into the system. It oftentimes some of the questions come of like, well, doesn't that mean we're going to have a smelly plant on our site? And the thing is, when you have the shorter run, it actually doesn't have the ramifications like the smells and the need for as much chemicals to treat it, because it hasn't traveled as far. So it's happening much more efficiently. And so we have the confidence of that through putting it next to one of our major office buildings. So its proximity is closest to trains and us. So we believe in it. But
Yeah.
it really it shows how it helps the system to really create that treatment system on site versus trying to ship it a long distance and have the same effect.
That's awesome. And it's great to hear that you can find a business case for these kinds of sustainable investments as well, which I think is really promising. You talked about community engagement and what an incredibly robust process you went through. Can you just remind me how many residents you all interacted with or
Oh
heard
my
from?
goodness, it's like thousands and thousands. It's
Yeah,
got to be in like the,
right.
double digit thousands. So it was really material, and I have to say that is characteristic of San Jose. It's
Yes.
just it's such an engaging city, and it's part of what I think we all love about San Jose. So very grateful for that. Just
Yeah,
make
no, absolutely. I mean, as I was a candidate, I went out and knocked on 10,000 doors, and I was just amazed by the level of engagement and the
awesome.
understanding the community has. And so I'm curious, and maybe we can talk about this in the context of pre-COVID and post-COVID, what you've heard from the community. As I talk to people about your project and many others, there's always sort of a guarded optimism. There's a fear that growth can be good. We need jobs. We need housing. It can also come with downsides. And so I'm curious, as you listen to the community, if you could maybe just highlight a couple of the areas of maybe skepticism or concern, and then how you sort of bake that into the plan for the project, and sort of how you took into account the community's questions or concerns about what this might mean for our community.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to get what we heard and what we try to do is it's one thing to get feedback, and it's another thing to design to that feedback. And so I think that was really the bridge we were,
Mm-hmm.
that's Google, by the way, is, as you know, we're an organization that's very user centric. So it's sort of
Yep.
not just about getting the feedback, it's about figuring out how do you change the design or the fundamentals of the project to match those challenges and create the right type of ecosystem. So maybe two very different types of examples, because one is more physical, so it's sort of easier to digest, is the neighborhood right adjacent to the site was very concerned because it's largely single family. So the idea of having like a 200-foot tower right at your doorstep as a single family sounds jarring, which is completely reasonable. Very pro-growth neighborhood, which we really appreciated. It was just about how do we figure out a way to more sensitively create that transition so it feels good and it feels in context. And so we were able to really work on those edges and figure out with them where those edges were most important and how we come up with a set of design guidelines that really steps into the neighborhood and really creates the type of material character as well that is more natural and wood oriented and the right type of softness to it that meets that type of neighborhood. And so it makes it better and not worse. And so we went from everywhere from there of really understanding and sorting through where those moments were, to delivering a really different type of park system, which had with it lots of anxiety, because normally in San Jose, what you see is larger scale recreation parks, sort of the classic green spaces. I think, by and large, San Jose's density has been more suburban in its growth historically. And so that
Yep.
type of park system is really common for that type of growth. What we're doing here is higher density, and people were saying, look, we really want these areas where we can come and participate. And we're not coming to participate always to go buy a coffee or, spend money at a restaurant. We want to come to participate because we're coming together. And that was, a different type of open space. It's an open space that has a lot of programming to it. That's really about free movie nights and having musical events and having reasons for everyone to come to the site, not even just proximate to the neighborhood. And so, that requires some different rules that were new to people. And so some of that is like, you get both like a real excitement of like, yes, that's the type of network we want. But you also get, wait a second, where's that large green park? And so, all of those things are the balancing acts of the project of how do we really listen to that and make sure we also have those immersive green spaces, because it doesn't mean we want to shut out nature. So it's really about those balance of pieces.
Yep.
And I agree with you. Of course, it's concerning to think about the physical growth, because it is a really different type of growth than what San Jose has experienced before. And so, wants to feel livable, wants to feel of San Jose. And because it's a different type of height and module and density than San Jose is used to, of course, there's going to be naturally a bit of skepticism.
Yeah.
And we just need to prove it out and kind of build it out and continue those dialogues, make sure the design's right. We're not, we're certainly at the beginning versus the end of that journey, but I feel really comfortable that after phase one, that's when people will be like, okay, I'm starting to feel that exactly what we said is starting to really be put into action. So we're really
Yeah.
excited for that. Otherwise, I think it's completely natural. I would be skeptical too until I see the output. The second piece that was really fun to lean into, and so thankful to the equity community for coming and sitting down with us and helping us understand what's happening within the world of what are a series of very high performing nonprofits within the equity space in San Jose. And so I think San Jose is super fortunate to have the partners they have. But what happens sometimes is there's a gap between how the funding works for those nonprofits and their ability to be effective and interdisciplinary around issues of housing and opportunities. And so therein lie the idea of the fund model, which allows for adaptability and change over time and allows for the integration of what's happening in the world of somebody who's spiraling into homelessness. They both have a housing issue and they have an opportunity gap and an opportunity issue. And how do we solve that more holistically instead of through separate buckets, which the current funding model really is designed for? And so I think that's really exciting to see how that will go forward.
Yeah, I think it's really innovative, and I'm very excited to see how that plays out. I think it's really promising. And just on your first issue that you're grappling with, I'll just add that I think you hit the nail on the head. I think we have to demonstrate to people that density can work for everyone and can provide a really high quality of life. And I've sort of experienced both ends of that spectrum, growing up out in the country, living now in a pretty suburban environment, but also having lived for years in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., and spent a lot of time in New York and Boston. And I think dense urban environments can provide an incredibly high quality of life, but they're not for everyone all the time. And I think having that diversity in our city and demonstrating that we can have these intensely urban areas that still are a welcoming, vibrant, safe, beautiful, healthy place is something. I'm glad that we're seeing the growth in that direction with a partner like Google that is approaching this in a very holistic way, because I think if we were just putting a bunch of nondescript skyscrapers in, not really thinking about the broader experience that people have of that built environment, I think it might not work as well as I think it will in this format. Relatedly, I guess, a concern that comes up frequently when we talk about growth in San Jose has to do with basically traffic and parking. And you've had a lot of success at other campuses, at least with your employees, getting people out of the single occupancy vehicle. But can you just talk to us a little bit about, and obviously you chose your location very carefully as well, but what should San Jose residents know about what you're doing to ensure that this growth in jobs and housing isn't going to just mean more time sitting in the car in traffic?
Yeah, no, well, the big investment on the physical front is through creating the connections of bike trails, walking paths, making alternative modes easier and a better experience. So there's about 7 miles of new networks that are brought into the system. And those actually also, when you look at the link of, like, if you're going to take an e-bike from here to, for example, because we have looked at this, probably not surprisingly, to a Mountain View, this is sort of the corridor where that link is broken from San Jose, of like the bike network isn't quite there yet. And so I think it's an important link to round out the whole network.
Yeah.
So I think you probably will see a significant increase of bike usage. It is actually only about a 20-minute ride to get from one place to another. Obviously, we don't feel like that because in rush hour, it is an hour and a half drive to get from one place to the other. So I think it's really about finding those modes, making them a better experience, creating better systems for them, and making the site itself extremely walkable. And so a lot of what you saw us do is not reduce capacity everywhere. It was also just to make streets multimodal, to allow the car to flow well, to allow bikes to coincide with it well, to do things like raised intersections where you need to in order to calm things and slow things down at the right moment. And so that you have an efficient network that is able to hold and host the multimodal strategy that is, the transition that the whole region is going through. In
Yeah.
addition to that, obviously, we've been huge supporters of the expansion of transit. We want to see, more transit come in the region, and we are really excited to see Caltrain and high-speed rail and some of those modes start to mature. And so we did quite a bit of work and invested quite a bit with the DISC partners to look at how do we create a buffer along transit that allows for that eventual expansion. And so you'll see within the plan, there's a buffer zone that allows for the expansion to come in the future and for the two projects to coexist really nicely. And I think that outer capacity is only going to make things better. We likewise do things when the capacity is not there yet. And so that, sometimes comes in the form of shuttles or, joint ventures with people like the VTA around express buses to help, create the transition point in between that inevitable place that we all hope to be in 30 years and where we are today. So
Yeah.
we have a big transportation team that focuses 100% on this. And as you said, we're doing it very actively within the network now.
Yeah, and I think, as you point out, this is a transition. It's going to be a perhaps challenging transition, but I think we're going to get there, especially with BART coming in to Diridon. I think there's just a huge increase in capacity, and the upgrades to Caltrain are huge. I mean, I really think in the long run, especially with Google's presence there, Diridon Station has the potential to be one of the most important transportation hubs on the West Coast, which is exciting. Maybe if you can give us some just metrics on either, your target for percentage of employees who will use transit or, walking, biking to get to this campus, or maybe just share with us the progress you've made up in Mountain View, because I know that's been pretty significant.
Yep. So in Mountain View, our modal splits, which are totally public, but in this site, we are building capacity for only about 25%, like once we're totally built out of the office to have office workers to have the capacity to drive in.
Okay.
That will shift over time. So, as you read through the documents, what we're doing is we're solving for a couple things. We're solving largely the parking count, to be honest, came out of a need of the arena to make sure that their car capacity maintained and stayed the same. I think we would have been more aggressive on reducing the volume of parking at our end state than we were. But as you said, this is, sort of an arc over time. So that 25% is going to be higher in the beginning. And we've created a transportation demand management plan that then shows the other mode splits of walking, biking, shuttles, et cetera, which then lead to, once BART opens, there's a new threshold.
Right.
And so we're matching to the transportation piece coming online, and the modes therefore shift over time, which is just rational and logical. And sort of, we did lots of analysis with transportation consultants and using the data we had from other campuses as well to sort through what was a reasonable modal shift over time.
Right.
The TDM also, which is the Transportation Demand Management Plan, has various levels of investment. So if it's not working, we invest more into those alternative modes to get that single occupancy vehicle number down in order to equalize it. So it's an over the time regulated and maintained system, which I think is really useful as we go from point A to point B. So, that being said, the majority are not taking single occupancy vehicles to work, which I think is really great. But it does mean we invest a lot in alternative modes and in things like biking and so forth. We also, don't subsidize parking for the Googlers in this campus. So there's some different methodologies we have here compared to some of our other campuses.
Interesting. So yeah, there's an incentive maybe to not drive and park. So you think basically bottom line is in the long run, you guys think it's feasible for about 75% of the workers here to be taking an alternative to a single occupancy vehicle.
That's right.
We're going to be making the investments to help make sure that that's true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not like when you look at a Mountain View or Sunnyvale in San Francisco, by way of example, even in sites that have less transit accessibility to it, we don't have any parking.
Right.
So, people, it just depends on what Googlers are used to and just making sure we can still help them efficiently get to work.
Right. Right. Okay, so I want to get to our audience questions in a moment, and you've been super generous with your time. I did want to just quickly touch on two other questions before we transition here. So one was just the impact, if any, of COVID on your plans, and people often, ask me, and I have no insight into this. You probably would know better. Does the experience we just went through with COVID and remote work and distance learning and all the rest of what we've been through, does it change how you think about your campus and how much space you need and how it will be used? And has that had any impact on your forward-looking plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we know are two things. One is we don't know all the solutions today because it's so early, but we also know that it's really important to come together. So, I think in the beginning we were all experiencing a fair amount of struggle and a fair amount of like just work productivity. For those of us, I have a child at home that's doing the home learning and so forth. So I think those of us in our camp, maybe we're skewed from this generalization, but where one could say that working from home was more efficient in some ways if you had childcare and you didn't have some of those issues going on or adult care. So, but what happens is over time, when you can't collaborate with that person next to you, you can't build new relationships, you can't onboard somebody and give them the network they need in order to be really successful, you realize that there's no way to grow and be a strong organization without having in-person time. So the reality is it's going to be a balance, and that balance will be around flexibility. And it'll also be more and more important that the types of environments we're producing, you feel like you're kind of coming to a social home and you're connecting to community. And so I think exactly what we all looked for in San Jose, I always say COVID isn't showing anything new. It's just sort of triple underlying some things we already knew, that access to nature, access to outdoor space, access to people and networks and citizen opportunities to volunteer and to be connected to your communities are going to be really important as part of the places we're building. So I think San Jose bodes really well for those objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And then my final question for you is another that I commonly get, which is, okay, so the plan's been approved, moving forward. What is the time? When should people expect things to happen, like physically out there at the site?
Yeah. Well, there is a bit of time for the planning phase. And so though we did the overall plan and the mixed use plan, we still need to go building by building and piece of infrastructure by piece of infrastructure and, submit those plans and go through them, make sure they have the right consistency with the documents, et cetera. And so that process isn't insignificant. So it'll be another, I would say 2 years of planning before anyone's going to be seeing shovels in the ground. But what's exciting is amongst the first phase of things, if you recall, we did advance some of the public benefits. And so A few $1 million is already in to start to address displacement issues, to start to think about establishing the community fund, et cetera. And then there's another 4 million roughly that comes in at the time in which, you know, the approvals are vested, which means any lawsuits have been cleared, which you know, could be as early as this fall. And so there's some good funds to come into simultaneous to that physical planning, start to invest the money to plan for this first phase coming over the next, you know, 2 to 5 years in completion. And so I think that's really was an important part of how we saw the community and the public benefits was, you know, this isn't all about building physical buildings. It's also about creating that right resilient community infrastructure to move forward with everything from affordable housing parcels early. There's 2 affordable housing parcels that have been advanced. So the number is not going to be 25% in our first phase. It's going to be more like probably 50% affordable housing.
Wow.
On a
Yeah.
relative basis. So, you know, you're seeing sort of those, we're trying to get ahead of some of those investments so that the growth is really experienced in a way that we're all after.
Yeah, I think that's great. You're able to front load some of those community benefits. That's awesome. Okay, and then in terms of the full, you had that beautiful sketch at the beginning of your slide deck of what a built out downtown West might look like. Are just rough. I mean, I'm sure you can't predict with any accuracy, but are we talking 10 years, 15 years? What's a rough timeline for when that might?
It's a little hard to say for the full build out because it does depend on some key components, like how quickly does BARC come in? So for example, they need one of our sites as a staging area while they build the tunnel. So we just can't build on that site until they're done. There's also, you know, in the north, we need a certain amount of work to happen within the DISC partners or to understand their line a little bit better before building buildings. We still have with the Sharks, you know, we have to work through ABC a bit more, or else that one emerges more like 2040 as an opportunity. So we've got some interdependent pieces, as you would expect from a complex urban site. So we always hate saying it's going to be, you know, X years or Y years for the full.
Sure.
But I don't think it's certainly not 5 because that is way too fast for a project of this scale. Typically, a project of this scale, normal world, is going to be like a 10 to 20 year build out, which I know is a long period of time, but it's just the reality of doing everything in a fashion that doesn't frankly overwhelm the system and still allows everything to function well around it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. Okay, thank you. Well, why don't we just wrap up with a few audience questions real quick. So, you know, you've mentioned the Sharks a couple of times, and I know there was some concern about the future of the Sharks, and so I know there's an agreement. There's basically a framework for moving forward that was signed by Google, the city, and the Sharks, as I understand. Can you just tell us, we're not going to lose the Sharks, are we? You probably
no. I mean, not. No, I don't think you're going to lose the You have to have the Sharks.
It's probably not your call, but yeah.
I mean, lots of things have happened to the world of arenas and sports with COVID and so forth that obviously don't have much to do with the project. But what we really tried to principally do is say, how can we keep the same amount of parking that they have today within a certain distance factor throughout the build out? So not just at the end of the build out, but make sure that they're smoothed out through the entire period so they can function well. And how do we also just coordinate construction and so forth with them in a way that makes sure nothing breaks down in the system as they're moving forward? That doesn't mean from time to time there won't be inconveniences, but you know, it does mean we need to make sure that everything's working as well together and as smoothly as we can, which actually, because of the counter-cyclical time nature of construction and evening and weekend events, I don't think is going to be quite as hard as maybe it could seem without thinking through the timing and so forth. So part of our first phase will have a significant underground parking structure in order to make sure we get some good parking coming online very quickly. And a lot of it was just working through some of those logistics around various machinations of phasing and planning to assure that it could work. And frankly, the Sharks are a neighbor just like everyone else is a neighbor. And as you said,
Yep.
council member, of course, there's going to be a certain amount of, just nerves going into how is this all going to work? It's a big project. And so I think certainly we understand and realize that we need to do it well, and just prove that it can work. And I think we all believe it can.
Yeah, good. Me too. I'm glad to hear that. Awesome. So just a few other quick questions. A great one from Rudy, who's watching on Facebook Live right now, which is just a question about, do you have an estimate for the percentage of employees here who are already San Jose residents and versus those commuting in from other places? And I know a lot of Googlers already live in San Jose. Do you have any
Yeah,
stats?
it's, what's interesting is San Jose is Google is a bit different depending on which business unit moves in. And because it's fairly far out for Google, we don't know quite which business unit would come in. But most business units, by and large, are over 50% within, a lot of them, when you look at the data, our majority are living in San Jose
That's
already. So
incredible.
it's actually kind of amazing how many Googlers are in San Jose today.
Yeah.
And so obviously they're doing a reverse commute, and this would be lessening that commute, which is a great thing for the grid as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the location is actually fantastic. So, okay, great. And then another question from Jeff here about how we define affordable housing, how affordable, what percentage. Can you just give us the rundown again of the affordable housing component of the commitment?
Yeah, absolutely. So 5% of the affordable 25 is built within the market rate housing for middle income. So that's anywhere from 80 to 100%. So that's your typically teachers, firefighters, police officers. It's that income level of a dual working household or a single working household.
And you're saying 80 to 120% of area median income. Is that right?
Right, to 100% of area median income.
100. Okay, got it.
And then there are dedicated sites that are then, we point fees to them to help fill that gap subsidy between the tax credit and how much it costs to build. And in addition to that, the city has the goal of this is what happens when I have a gap between June and now, but a substantial amount of those being 40% AMI and below. I believe it. So what you all are doing, and what the housing department will do is they'll go after Measure A funds and other funds to get to that deeper level of affordability, which is partly why we wanted to release as many and produce the infrastructure to pad ready as many as those affordable housing sites as early as possible, because we know that additional enhancement is there to get to very low income levels. And so I think you will see a much greater proportion of very low income than what you potentially see out there today in those dedicated sites. So those dedicated sites will be low and very low.
Okay. Yeah. Great. And then finally, just so I'm scanning through questions here, there's one, maybe we can answer it or maybe we'll have to take it offline, but the question about the amount of retail and entertainment, and I was expecting retail entertainment under the office is shown in the rendering, but didn't see that on the site plan. Can you clarify basically? So the rendering looks more like Santana Row, but the site plan does not. Does that make sense to you, Alexa? Or do you want to just, okay.
I think the rendering, well, it depends on which rendering. What we're required to do is where we're meeting public spaces in particular. But generally, so across the ground floor where it's sort of more activated and it's a frontage that's not on an alleyway or sort of a major thoroughfare, but is more on a green space or is more in the heart of like right outside the station, there's a requirement in the design guidelines for that to be the active use, so the pink. What was probably happening is in the diagram, it's a little hard to show that layer of pink. We just made it the primary use, so you were seeing the blue or the yellow versus the pink refinement on that ground floor.
And I think Karen was asking about the first rendering, so I don't know if you could quickly flash that back up as we close out here, just to orient people one more time.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Thanks for the question, Karen.
Let me just share the screen. Is this the one we're thinking of? So that's the first rendering technically. And then we'll go through.
And then if we go
graph.
all the way back to the very beginning,
Not sure there.
I think maybe we're talking about actually one end. I think maybe we might just be talking about this. And it says here, so some of the pink is a little bit hidden, maybe. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah,
there?
so basically where you see the blue and the yellow,
Yeah,
it's primary use. So you're not seeing that the ground floor is pink along here,
got it.
which
Yep,
I think throws, or it's pink, and it's pink along here. And so the design guidelines require ground floor retail and ground
yep.
floor active uses along the major facades that are hitting open spaces.
Got it. And pink is that active use. I just want to make sure for people
That's
who are
right.
viewing this,
So the
that's your
pink
retail.
here is that 500,000 of retail, cultural, arts, education uses. And all of that's laid out in the design guidelines, is just which is a public document, which is helpful to understand that level of nuance of like, you know, where are there requirements for active use and so forth.
Right, right. Awesome. Okay, I think we got that answered. Thanks for the question, Karen. And so Alexa, with that, do you have any closing thoughts or reflections? Any question I should have asked you? Anything the community should know that we haven't covered?
I don't think so. I mean, I think generally we're just really thankful for the phase we just went through, but very cognizant that it's the beginning. And so we've got our lots of work to do. So certainly not the last you'll see of us. And thank you for the ongoing partnership and participation. We'll really need that as we bring this to life.
Awesome. Well, we're here to keep working with you. Appreciate you taking the time to help the community understand exactly where we are today and where we intend to go. So I think it's a very exciting investment and project, and it's going to have a big impact, a big positive impact on our city for years and really, frankly, probably generations to come. So I just appreciate you taking the time to help explain all of that to our community, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me. Appreciate it.
All right, Alexa, take care. All the best.